Okay, so moving along. So because we're going to try to have this available for streaming afterwards, I just have 3 quick slides here, which are the images that are used in the webinar. It's really important to make sure we acknowledge those who are using images from, and are very grateful to those individuals who have produced those so that we can actually use them for this educational webinar. If there's anyone who has specific questions about the images that are used, please contact us and we'll be happy to comply. So I did this on the last webinar, but in case you're new to this one, this is a very quick overview. You can watch the other one on who I am. And the key piece that I wanted to highlight here is that I don't have a stake in the game in terms of I have no real conflicts of interest. So I'm really just a guy who has worked on ALS for a lot of years, who is really invested in trying to find therapies and understand the science of ALS as quickly as possible. I'd be very happy to find another job today, tomorrow, whenever, if we could find something. And so that is the standpoint at which I'm sharing this information. Again, I don't know everything. I do know a lot about ALS, but always validate the things that you hear here with other sources to confirm what you are hearing. Again, if there was something real anywhere in the world that we knew worked, we would do everything we could to make sure we get that to you as quickly as possible. So we'll talk a little bit about those things. And this one I want to add quickly, talk to your doctor. And the reason why is I am not an MD. I have a PhD working on ALS and related ALS research experience, but I am not a medical physician. So it's really important to talk to a clinician who can provide medical advice around your specific connection to ALS. And so in this particular case, this is an information sharing so that you can then go to your physician and be able to be well equipped with the information that you need. So this is also something that I do in every webinar. Again, it's in the previous one, which will hopefully be streaming, so I'm going to cut it a little shorter today. The point here is, what are we trying to do when we're going to look at interventional clinical trials in ALS? And that's really to rescue these guys. They're called motor neurons. And every muscle cell of the body is connected by an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. And essentially, when these connections of these living wires degenerate or are lost, you have a progressive paralysis that spreads throughout the body. And you can imagine that if you have paralysis and the ability to breathe and the muscles allowing you to breathe, this is what makes it a terminal disease. Now, this is my crude diagram to show you that upper motor neurons start in the brain. They project down to the spinal cord. That's the representation of the black lines. And then the blue lines are lower motor neurons, which connect from the upper motor neurons, leave the spinal cord, and they go out to the muscles in the body. And so an electrochemical signal moves along both of those. And what we're trying to ultimately do in ALS is figure out internally what's going wrong with those motor neurons. How can we rescue what is going dysfunctional in those motor neurons? And as well, what we've learned over the years is that there are a number of different cell types that surround the motor neurons in our central nervous system that are really designed to help keep them happy and healthy throughout the duration of our lifetime. And in ALS, we know that they're also dysfunctional in their proper roles. And so we can also target these with therapies to try to make the neighborhood around those motor neurons a happier and healthier environment. This is also something I showed in the last webinar. I'm really going to go through it quickly. This is my one pager on sort of where we've come in ALS research, coming back from the first sort of well-known recognition of the disease in 1939 when famous baseball player Lou Gehrig was diagnosed and passed away 2 years later. By 1993, we were finally able to really study this in the laboratory. Technology and discoveries allowed us for the first time to do this. But it wasn't until 2006 that we really kind of got a grip on some of the more key aspects of how ALS is working in the majority of cases. And in the past 7 years or so, we've made huge strides. And especially if you go back and see the other webinar, you'll notice that I talk a lot about funding differences between treatable diseases that receive a lot of funding from various sources and where ALS is at in terms of funding. And we've really come a very long way, and that's been due to very strong and focused investments on the right type of research to help us understand this very complex disease. And we're very hopeful in 2019 that a lot of those connections we've made over the past 7 years or so will start to move into the clinic, and some of them already have, and we'll start to see more of those in the near future. I'm going to skip this slide. This is really just to show you again, in terms of our ability to start to have tools to work within the disease, they've really expanded in the past a decade or so, and that's ultimately going to correlate into greater and faster discoveries with each given year that we move forward in ALS research. And this also probably doesn't mean much to anyone. This is sort of a diagram from a review article of where we're at in understanding the disease. What I can say is that 5 to 7 years ago, if you looked at this diagram of what we understood about ALS, it would be far less sophisticated. And a lot of these things would be things that existed and are actually really prominent pieces to the puzzle of understanding ALS, but we would just simply have not known about them. So that, emphasizes the strides that we have made. One thing I'm going to say actually before we get into this, I also want to be really open and honest about the fact that, I talk about a lot of the clinical trials that are happening, that they're promising and that we're looking forward to getting the results on them. Again, it is very understood, and I completely empathize with the fact that for a lot of people listening to this webinar, when I say something is going to have results in 2021 or 2022, that's not something that is particularly helpful for a person who's listening now, but it is really the true state of where we are in terms of the science. So I want to give you the real information, but also be compassionate to the fact that, I do understand when there's hope put around those things. We also have to consider the fact that a lot of people right now want to be able to figure out how they can contribute and also figure out how they can help themselves in the current day. So I'm not going to talk a lot about edaravone radicava. This is something I've talked about in previous trial ones, largely because this is now more of a treatment at the moment as opposed to a clinical trial, although there is still some relationship to clinical trials. Happy to take questions on this afterwards, but I'm not going to focus a lot on it. People do have questions though. Certainly, where is this in the process of being able to get radicava to people living with ALS in Canada? It is approved by Health Canada, but is not yet available. It's not manufactured by the company for Canada. And the reason for this is really around the fact that in Canada, after something is approved and considered to be effective by Health Canada, there are a number of processes or say hurdles that a company needs to go through in order to be able to get a point where they would want to manufacture and sell the drug. One of the big hurdles that does exist is something called the PMPRB, which is the Patented Medicine Pricing Review Board. And that ultimately is a way in Canada in which our government helps to set, a government body helps to set what is the price that a company can sell its therapy or its drug at to Canadians. You can imagine that as a company, you need to be able to sell your drug to have a return on investment, to have a market. Whereas the Canadian government also doesn't want a company to come in and overprice what it's got. So it's this fine balance that is going back and forth. And it is in this stage. We're not exactly sure exactly where it's in this stage, but it is in the stage where if there is a viable market for edaravone, then we would likely see that Pharma Canada would start to market this at least first to private insurance coverage and to out-of-pocket payers, because once Health Canada is approved, that is something that can happen. But then the next steps are that it needs to go through to try to get to a provincial payer system in our public healthcare plan across the country. So as I said, there needs to be a viable market for them to be actually able to launch the drug. Relation to clinical trials, there's likely to be more clinical trials coming from edaravone and edaravone-related products. We don't have any information specifically on what those will be, but it's likely to happen. In particular, one thing that would sort of drive towards that is a press release that came out not that long ago, indicating that the company has been working on an oral formulation of edaravone, and we would likely see that come to clinical trials somewhere in the world in the near future. There's also another oral form that I won't be talking about that has been in some aspect of clinical trial. We're not sure exactly where that's at. There hasn't been a lot of recent news on it that I've been able to obtain from a company called Treeway Therapeutics in Europe, and you can also look that up if you want to learn more about that one. But that's what I'm going to say about edaravone radicava for the moment, but certainly happy to take questions moving forward. What is a clinical trial? I spoke about this before. This is any experimental study that's happening in humans living with ALS that's governed by Health Canada in terms of being able to be tested in Canadians. There are equally as important clinical trials that are not focused on slowing progression of the disease, but also we need these to learn more about the disease itself. Certainly very important ones around finding better ways to manage the symptoms. There are a couple, like the Parkinson's drug called Masitinib that's being tested for spasticity. There's another one called Reldasemtiv, which is being tested. It's usually for chest pain, but also may relieve some of the symptoms of ALS. And these are also very important clinical management clinical trials that are happening as well. We're not going to focus on those as much. Today, we're going to focus on the ones that I get a lot of questions on, which are the interventional clinical trials around slowing or stopping disease progression, or at least aiming towards that. Now, it must be remembered that these are scientific studies where humans are volunteering to participate. They do not pay to be involved in clinical trials. They may have to pay to travel to a place to be involved in a clinical trial, or if it's not in your given country, you may have to pay for the medical care surrounding the trial. But specifically for anything involved in the experimental study itself, you do not pay, because either it is covered by an academic grant or a pharmaceutical company or a biotech company will have the cost of that, because you're trying to learn ultimately whether or not it works, whether it is safe, and also what should be added is whether it's tolerable, because sometimes safe does not necessarily mean it's a tolerated drug or therapy. Key piece is here that there are studies, because we don't know the answer and nobody knows the answer. And if the answer was known, then those organizations or those companies or the scientists would be applying to Health Canada and FDA to get approval for those. So it's really a way of trying to understand if that's the case. And probably the message that's the hardest to give is that really clinical trials are a philanthropic endeavor. They are out there for people to contribute to science so that we can understand for the future whether or not something actually works for ALS. And I know that, and I would be the same way as anyone if you're currently living with ALS, or I had ALS and I wanted to be involved in a clinical trial, you certainly want to give yourself the best shot to maybe be on that kind of breakthrough therapy that might slow progression of the disease, and you're hopeful that you're not on a placebo arm. Certainly go back to the last webinar. I explained a lot about why placebos are still very important in ALS clinical trials. You see this on TV and movies all the time about being involved in a revolutionary clinical trial that can slow disease, but ultimately we have to look at clinical trials as a way of contributing to science to get answers, and they are discrete studies often that are really not aimed yet at actually treating individuals. So that's a key and difficult piece to message as well. In terms of what they are, in terms of the phases, I'm going to quickly go back through those. I know I'm already in time off the clock here, and I will get to the trials next. Phase 1 clinical trials are really a way in which we first learn if something's safe or tolerable. So you have a small group of individuals. You usually have different doses or regimens that you want to find out what is the best one to move forward with. Is there one that we can move forward with that seems to have biological activity but is also going to be safe and tolerable for people to take it? Phase 2 really needs to be seen as an extension of the phase 1 in the sense that it is, are we seeing the same safety and tolerability in a larger group of people? Because phase 1, it's usually a small group of individuals, and as we know, humans are all very different. You need to make sure it's really that make or break point often for a company that says, is this something we want to put all of our might behind in a phase 3 clinical trial to throw that big Hail Mary pass and say, is this going to actually work for ALS? Now, often phase 2 trials will give a small indication as to whether or not there's some inkling as to whether something will work, but something I'm going to mention several times, and I already have in the past webinar as well, is that we have to be very careful in interpreting phase 2 trial data, especially when it's not powered up statistically to get a really significant answer. And already these phase 2 clinical trials, as you can see, can be quite expensive. Sometimes they're less than $10 million, or can be $1 million or $2 million. But these are things that really need to be covered often by private industry in a partnership with science in order to drive these things forward, because they're very expensive. Phase 3 clinical trials, you know, these are really expensive trials, things that obviously someone like ALS Canada can't afford to put through for the most part. The idea is really, does this work for ALS? Is this something that they can put forward to Health Canada or the FDA to say, will it, you know, this is really a viable therapy that can slow progression or have an effect on ALS as a disease? So we're going to start with the phase 3 clinical trials. These are really the registration trials, as I said. These are the ones that are being really powered up in a way that are hopeful to get an answer as to whether something works or not, with the intention of being able to apply to a country to have it approved for actual sale to people living with ALS and prescribed for them. These are, as I said, very expensive. And so one thing a question I get a lot is about why the cost of treatment is so high for ALS drugs and for rare disease drugs. And for those who aren't aware of this, a large part of the reason is, multiple hundreds of millions of dollars are often invested by a company in order to get their therapy through to this point. And so at that point, as a business who are beholden to investors, they need to have a return on investment. So they need to sell the drug at a high enough level to make a profit. And in the case of a disease like ALS, you don't have as much prevalence as, say, a disease like cancer. The cost has to be higher in order to recoup that value. So a smaller market, and I'm not talking Canada versus the US here, but a smaller market in terms of, say, ALS versus stroke means often that there's a higher price. And one that you may have seen very recently, just this month, that was announced was the most expensive drug therapy ever for a motor neuron disease in children called Zolgensma. Has $2 million for a single dose that can actually turn children from a terminal disease into one where they're actually meeting many of the milestones of kids who don't have the disease. So it's a pretty amazing therapy that they've seen in clinical trial. But again, the cost is very high because they're not going to recoup that from thousands and thousands of individuals. And the big piece about phase 3 clinical trials, they have to be well designed to get clear answers. And I urge you to go back to the previous part 1 to learn more about that. Big cool piece here, though, is that there's way more than ever in ALS. We're talking about potentially 7 or 8 phase 3 clinical studies in 2019 and 2020. And at most, I can remember in the past 7 years, maybe having 1 or 2 at any given time going on. And that's really to also highlight or emphasize the advancements that we've made in both clinical trials and our understanding and our driving forward towards therapies for the disease. So 18 minutes in and I'm finally getting to this. I may go a little bit over, so hopefully that's not going to cause too many problems. Good thing we're on demand here, but I'm going to start with something that I often don't highlight first. But I am going to talk about it first, which is stem cell therapies for ALS, because it's something that without question, I get more questions about over the past 7 years in this role than anything else. And so the other reason why is because we are finally at a stage where we're going to learn a little bit about a stem cell potential therapy for ALS with a phase 3 clinical trial that is happening right now from the company Brainstorm. A little background on the company, and this certainly is not comprehensive. So this is just to give you some information on where we're at today. This is a company out of Israel that was really designed the therapy from the preclinical or laboratory work by Dr. Daniel Offen and Dr. Eldad Malamed from Tel Aviv. And these two gentlemen in their lab work found that, these things called neurotrophic factors, which we've known about for many years, might have a potential effect on motor neuron health. And that if you were able to equip stem cells that are derived from the bone marrow, they then, with the ability to secrete these growth factors, this could potentially help to slow progression in ALS models or animal models that were found in the laboratory. So this was in the 2000s, and then this correlated into a therapy in Israel, which ultimately was Brainstorm's therapy. Now, this became something that was well known, and a lot of the questions have been raised. Starting back in 2012, when I first started in this role, a gentleman named Rabbi Shmulevitz from Israel was apparently getting up and walking for the first time since he'd been treated with Brainstorm. This was obviously something that there wasn't a lot of scientific information out there at that point, but we have these media releases, so this led to a lot of questions. A lot of the questions also come in because, and this is not to be connected to Brainstorm in any way, this is just, again, an overall messaging around stem cells, but the fact that, people believed or have been told over the years that stem cells are sort of these magic cells that can certainly do anything in our body, and certainly in the fact of ALS, this can be a much more complex thing. And I'll get into that as we move forward in the next few slides. So around 2016, some of that early work that was happening in Israel was published in a peer-reviewed article. That's great. That helps to provide some open data to the scientific community around what is actually happening in the Brainstorm clinical trials. And then soon after, there was an announcement from the company around the first phase 2 clinical trial to happen in the United States at 3 prominent centers, which had pretty cautiously optimistic results as opposed to coming out of that trial. It's still not published, so we don't know for sure, you know, what's coming out of the data, but at least it's a cause for some cautious optimism, and certainly a reason enough to see what's going to happen in the phase 3 clinical trial. And that's really where they're at now. So that a phase 3 clinical trial at 6 sites in the United States. Again, in part 1, I talked about the fact that, you know, people say often, why is this not in Canada? Well, there are many reasons why it was more advantageous for them to run this in the United States. They already had a relationship with the FDA. They already had infrastructure built at 3 of the spots in the US, and they have put forth quite an effort to allow Canadians to be able to travel to the sites and be involved in the clinical trial if eligible. There is a targeting for 2020 for completion of the clinical trial. The idea here is that it provides stem cells that might be able to boost or help protect existing motor neurons to preserve their function longer, and not designed to replace your motor neurons. We're going to talk about that in a little more detail in the next couple slides. The phase 2 clinical trial did show, through the media releases at least, that there seemed to be a promising slowing of disease progression. But again, there's only cautious optimism because this was, again, an underpowered study, which is why there needs to be a phase 3 study. We do not know at this point if it actually works. And I'll show you actually diagrammatically what is involved in the trial in the next one, but it's essentially removing the stem cells from the bone marrow, treating them with the NurOwn, and then reintroducing those to the body. And one of the things that's added in this phase 3 clinical trial that also I'm not mentioning yet is that there will be 3 doses of the stem cells as opposed to 1 in previous trials, with the hope that this can have a greater effect than what was potentially seen in the phase 2 clinical trial. So in terms of Canadians watching this, there is some representation of Canada in Brainstorm with Dr. Ralph Kern, who's a Canadian neurologist associated with the company. And as I said, Canadians are eligible to participate. So if it is something like any other phase 3 clinical trial that's out there, if it does prove to actually work for ALS, we'll be trying very hard to get the company to want to apply to Health Canada. Now, very briefly, what happens when you're involved in this study? There's a screening visit, then an enrollment visit. After 2 months, if you are deemed eligible on the enrollment visit, then you will have bone marrow extraction from your bone marrow. These are then under very sterile conditions. There are cells called mesenchymal stem cells that are cultured up and expanded, meaning there's more of them. They're treated with the drug NurOwn, which is said to boost these neurotrophic factors. And then repeated 2 months apart, 3 injections into the space around the fluid that bathes the spinal cord in the brain called the cerebrospinal fluid, with the hope that this will actually slow progression of disease. And they will look over the course of 7 months. So once it's fully recruited, you have to imagine that last person recruited, you have to measure them for 7 months to be able to see if there's a difference between the placebo and those on the Brainstorm trial, and then be able to analyze the results after that, which is why it's about 2024 before results can actually be seen. As a placebo, again, these individuals will be compared to those who do not have an injection of the stem cells. And in this particular case, part 1 delineates exactly why that is still important in ALS at this given day. Now, I'm gonna actually come back to one thing about NurOwn in the last slide, but one of the questions that comes up inevitably around this, and it probably shouldn't be connected to Brainstorm because it's connected to anything where there have been some questions around why ALS societies, particularly Ice Bucket Challenge funds, wouldn't be invested in trying to speed up a phase 3 clinical trial. Something I didn't mention too much in the last webinar that I want to bring up is, you know, they're very, very expensive. And the only time in the entire field we've ever had enough money to fund really a big industry-sized phase 3 clinical trial would be the IBC funds, Ice Bucket Challenge funds that were raised in the US. And, you know, the big thing is we don't know if any of these are working. That's the big thing. And if it does work and it's not a cure, so this is again not just talking about Brainstorm, but anything that would be invested in, that means all of the money has gone into something that is partially working. And then we have no more money to be able to invest in the research that can help us to get to better treatments or treatments that can augment whatever one would be invested in, or even potentially someday a cure. And if it doesn't work, this could really set back ALS research. And there really aren't that many places that will fund ALS. So those Ice Bucket Challenge funds were a tremendous gift that were entrusted for wise use. And there's also some ethics around the fact of crowdfunded, very precious and tremendous gift funds that have come to ALS societies being ultimately helped to for-profit companies that are standing eventually to make money off people living with ALS. So there are a number of things out there that explain that question, and I wanted to just raise it up because I want to be very direct with everyone as to these kind of questions that are raised. But there have been a lot of great collaborations that have happened between industry trials and academic collaborations to find biomarkers, for example. And it is really a partnership that has to move forward between science and industry and government to be able to really move these things forward. Now, another thing that we have to, I want to reiterate is that, we don't know the answer for any of these clinical trials, and we have seen a number of times that we've had promising phase 2 clinical trials that have ultimately failed in phase 3 when they've had a more rigorous study put around them. And so when we come back to NurOwn, the two things I really want to say about this is that we should remain cautiously optimistic. So far, there's nothing to prove that it works, but there's also nothing to say that we shouldn't believe it could work. And that allows us to remain cautiously optimistic, waiting for those results sometime in 2020. And that's what I have to say about that, but I'm happy to talk about it more afterwards. Now, in terms of stem cells as an ALS treatment, again, I wanted to really take the time to focus on this because the questions I get a lot. Again, these are largely focused on providing support to existing motor neurons and not aimed at replacing motor neurons. Most of the trials are what I probably very crassly call suck and dump trials, in that they're essentially taking stem cells from one part of the body and putting them into the area around the brain or spinal cord and hoping that they will have this protective effect. Now, we do not know at this point if those stem cells have any clue on how they can provide a nurturing environment for the motor neurons, which is why things like NurOwn or other ones might be something that needs to be given to the stem cells, or maybe they don't need to be given anything, or maybe none of the stem cells work whatsoever. And that's something that a lot of people are studying in various trials around the world, these sort of just putting the stem cells in and seeing that they're working. But again, we have zero evidence from really any trials that prove whether or not they work or not. And again, there's around 13 trials happening in 7 different countries. I'll talk about one in a second that we'll be finishing this year that might give us some indication as to whether something's there, but again, still probably underpowered. The concept of neural replacement in terms of putting cells in that can replace your motor neurons is something that we're probably just not quite there yet. But there's some interesting thoughts at the preclinical level on how we might approach this, or even some unique ideas. But really, if we're talking about stem cells in your liver is made up of all the same type of cell called hepatocytes. So you're trying to build basically a mass of a certain type of cells. Whereas your central nervous system is far more complex. Your motor neurons make the connections to your muscles when you're about the size of a bean. And then they continue to grow with you. So you can imagine trying to rewire a full-sized human body is very difficult, especially when you consider the train tracks, for example, that connect the brain to the muscles are filled with motor neurons that are degenerating. So how do you actually send a train from the brain to the muscles if there was, say, a subway map in between them to represent the wiring of our body, if those train tracks are already covered by degenerating or trains that are stalled, for example. Now, a couple other stem cell trials of interest that we can keep an eye on. There's a phase 1 clinical trial happening in Cedars-Sinai based around the idea of turning the stem cells into supporting cells called astrocytes. And that's run by Dr. Clive Svensson, Dr. Bob Balow. And that's targeted to be completed in terms of the safety study this year. So that's something we can look on with interest. Another phase 1 trial that is yet to get going in terms of recruitment are something called Q cells you can look up, which has sort of a similar idea to it. When I talked about those untreated stem cells, that sort of suck and dump idea, There's a prominent investigator in the field, Dr. Nathan Staff at the Mayo Clinic, who is targeting completion of doing one of these studies. Again, 60 participants is likely not enough to really see what we really need to see if it's working, but it might give some indication as to whether or not there's some promise around these therapies from a good and rigorous clinical trial. And there are unique ideas that are being tried in the labs. For example, can we convert some of the cells that are surrounding motor neurons into motor neurons themselves, which would ideally be ones that are already existing in the central nervous system and along the same sort of tracks that our motor neurons are existing in. But again, we're probably not there with technology yet to really understand how we can rewire the body with stem cells. Last one I'm going to talk about with stem cells, again, because it's a question I get a lot, is around something called CoreStem or NurOwn in South Korea. This one has a similar approach to Brainstorm, but they're using their own chemical called NurOwn to try to boost the protective abilities of the stem cells. There was a publication that got a lot of talk in the scientific literature last year about a phase 2 clinical trial. The key piece that we need to focus on here is that this was an open label clinical trial where the controls also did not have any kind of sham treatment. So you are both the people evaluating, the people involved in the trial, but specifically the people who are on it know that they are receiving the stem cells, and those who don't know that they are not. And these are the kind of things that we certainly cannot be reliable on, because even when people don't want to have bias in how they're doing, there is some inherent bias that exists in these things. Actually, there's a gentleman who describes the process of going through this quite a bit, and during that description, he does talk about how when he was being introduced to it, he was being told that he should receive some benefit, which again is something kind of interesting when it comes to interpreting this data. So we do not know if this works at all. There is no evidence if this works. So yes, it's approved in South Korea for whatever reason that is the case. There are discussions about potential trials in North Korea. Or sorry, oh my gosh, in North America, there's $100,000 to be able to go get that trial or that treatment done. But again, that could be $100,000 going to something that has effect, because we simply do not know or cannot prove if there's any work. And the key piece here, again, like I'd say with any of these, is that's just sharing information with you, but you need to ask your physician. So they can medically kind of give you a better opinion than I could about any individual person who is exploring this type of activity. Now, we're moving off stem cells, and we're going to move on to other things. Another phase 3 clinical trial that is happening in ALS. It is almost fully recruited. It may be as of now. And now we're waiting the 76 weeks to be able to see whether or not it has a significant effect on the disease. They've got a trial that is really designed to be very strong in terms of whether or not they can get an effect over a period of time on people living with ALS. This is a drug that has been around for a long time. In fact, back in 2003, there was a discovery of the drug in terms of being able to make motor neurons produce what are called heat shock proteins. So basically, what does this mean? Well, all the cells of our body do all of our functions with things called proteins. Our proteins have a specific 3D shape or fold that allows them to do all of their normal functions and keep cells happy and healthy. What we know is that when the cells become stressed, whether that's a disease, whether that's anything else, this can lead these proteins to become what are called misfolded, and then they no longer have their normal function, or they may have an extra toxic function. And so that's a bad thing for the cells, but we are equipped with mechanisms, which are sort of helpful mechanisms called heat shock proteins, which come in and refold those proteins into their normal shape and keep things status quo. Now, what we've learned over the years is that motor neurons have a really poor ability to do this refolding and produce these HSPs. And what Arimoclomol does actually is provide sort of the gas for the car that's not there in motor neurons to hopefully help them produce those HSPs, and maybe be able to keep the proteins that are affected in the stress of ALS happier and healthier, and hopefully slow progression of disease in motor neurons. We're targeting 2021 for completion. It's based around a clinical program that showed some promise in phase 2, but again, very underpowered and hard to be able to interpret whether it was having a significant effect. Second phase 3 clinical trial is actually also recruiting in Canada. So if you see the Canada flag up there, that means it's something that has clinical sites in Canada. A company called Orion Pharmaceuticals from Finland has a large phase 3 clinical trial that is targeting muscle. Basically, this and another company that I'll talk about in a few moments are targeting the fact that if you can help muscle respond better to the signals coming from motor neurons, can you give that muscle function a longer period and slowing progression of that muscle loss or paralysis that happens. This one is an oral pill, basically all of these are designed around heart medications that were designed to help the heart contract better in situations where they were getting less oxygenation from the blood. And then ultimately, can you then adapt this to give people better muscle function in ALS? And so hopefully by next year, we will understand what happened from this Orion pill. I'll speak more about it later if you'd like. Masitinib is one that should be coming soon. It has been one that has been delayed for a bit due to various reasons, but a large phase 3 clinical trial led by Dr. Angela Genge out of the Montreal Neurological Institute from the company AB Science is going to be put forward, hopefully starting to recruit by the end of 2019. And this is ultimately something that, again, from a phase 2/3 clinical trial, a fairly large phase 2 clinical trial a few years ago, did have promising underpowered information about slowing progression of ALS. So like with anything else, we don't know the answer, but these are the kind of things that you know we're interested in to see what will happen in phase 3. Now, this one is focused on a mechanism that is very popular in terms of current clinical trials, and that is focused on those cells that surround motor neurons, and particularly immune and inflammatory cells that are protective of motor neurons in a normal environment. But when ALS starts, they end up actually targeting the motor neurons and can actually reduce the viability of them and kind of provide an unfortunate neighborhood for them to try to survive in. So Masitinib is actually focusing on two particular cells, macrophages, which you can see are mentioned here, but also mast cells, and trying to reduce their inflammatory aspects and keep motor neurons that are surviving happier and healthier for a longer period of time. And there will be a number of phase 2 trials targeting these types of mechanisms as well. One that isn't talked about that much, but is starting into a phase 3 clinical trial. It's actually an academic trial, so it's probably not talked about that much because there's no return on investment necessarily needed around it. It's more led by scientific investigators. It's called a TUDCA trial, largely because no one wants to say toro-ursodeoxycholic acid. So this is basically a bile acid that may be protective against cell death mechanisms in our neurons. It's coming from the bile, so actually it's something that's found in bile, which is produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder. And if you've ever vomited a lot and you've seen that kind of brownish yellow material, that's bile. But it's actually one of the chemicals in that that's believed to potentially be protective. This is a European collaborative effort with an oral pill and is targeting 2021 for completion. Okay. Now, I apologize that skipped ahead. One that may have a phase 3, but we do not know whether it will move to phase 3 is a drug called Reldasemtiv. You may have heard me talk in the past about a drug called Tirasemtiv, which is from the company Cytokinetics. It's focused on much of the same mechanism as the Orion trial, using a different type of drug. So ultimately, this Tirasemtiv showed some promise in a phase 2 clinical trial, but one of the problems with Tirasemtiv when they ran a big phase 3 clinical trial is that it was safe, but it was not tolerable. So people were dropping out of the trial because it caused dizziness and nausea. And they've now alleviated this in Reldasemtiv, which just finished a phase 2 clinical trial, quite a large one. And this is actually an interesting one to mention. I'm mentioning this for a reason, because what you will see when you look up what happened to that phase 2 clinical trial is that ultimately it didn't work. And this is a very way of responsible messaging from the company, saying that ultimately it did not meet the metrics of the scientific study that they wanted to do. However, if we look at the data, I would say that in the hands of other organizations, and probably, you know, we've seen in the past examples of where this data might be talked about as promising data in a completely different way. And in fact, when we look at it scientifically, it does seem like it could be doing something, but certainly this is the example of an underpowered trial that doesn't significantly show the endpoints of what they were looking for. And so we're uncertain as to whether or not they'll invest in a phase 3 clinical trial. But again, I would say that the data doesn't look any worse than some other things that have been moved to phase 3 clinical trials in the past, and with the potential for working for ALS. In terms of Japan, there is a ultra high dose vitamin B12 injection that's happening based on other data that they some people feel is promising and others have said is underpowered from previous studies. This is one that is attempting to show a slowing of disease by a very large 500 times the dose that you would find in any over-the-counter medication, and again, an intramuscular injection as opposed to oral dosing. Vitamin B12, because vitamin B12 is available over the counter, it's a great example of me mentioning something that's happening in a phase 3 clinical trial, and I would urge you to please talk to your physician before you go out and consider taking any B12, because first of all, most of the things that you would get access to are clearly underpowered or under the amounts that would be used in this clinical trial. In terms of the availability of the B12 getting to your neurons or getting to your central nervous system, but also for each person's medical information, these things need to be considered by your physician. The last one I'm going to talk about with phase 3 clinical trials, and wow, I am talking a lot today. I apologize for this. I really want to make sure we get all the information out there, but I see it's 12:42. I'm going to try to speed up a little bit. Antisense oligonucleotides is something that I want to quickly focus on because I think it might have a lot of impact moving forward, potential impact on the field of ALS and ALS therapies from a general standpoint as well as particular therapies. This is a slide that I have shown in the past in webinars, and it's really to explain to you how things work inside a cell at a very basic level. So inside our cells, all of them, including motor neurons, have this command center called the nucleus. And that's where your DNA is stored and housed. It doesn't move, it stays in there, and that encodes all of the genetic information that you need for your cell to survive. Now, inside that DNA are particular genes. So we're going to focus on one here called SOD1. SOD1 gene information is translated into something called RNA. And that basically takes that genetic information and allows it to move around inside the cell to do the different things it needs to do. And one of the major things it needs to do is turn into a protein, so that information gets translated into the building of a protein. That protein then does things. So in the case of SOD1, it protects our motor neurons against a particular hazards of what are called free radicals, which can be toxic to the motor neuron. Now, ASOs are essentially a medicine that we can put in that will block the RNAs from producing the proteins by targeting them for degradation before that protein is produced. So that, in a way, allows us to very specifically target any particular protein that we want to reduce the levels are in that might potentially have an effect on ALS. And if we're talking about SOD1, we're talking about a phase 3 clinical trial that is now moving for something called Tofersen from Biogen. This is targeting SOD1, and we have learned over the years that SOD1 we learned in 1993 that this was the first discovered genetic cause of ALS in about 10% of familial cases. So about 2% of people with ALS will have SOD1 mutations. We know that SOD1 is important to our cells because it blocks those toxic free radicals I talked about. It has an antioxidant effect. But we also know that when there's a mutation in SOD1, most often it retains that ability to have the antioxidant effect, but it also gains some extra function that is toxic specifically to motor neurons and to the other cells around it. So the idea here is that with an antisense oligonucleotide, can we block that toxic gain of function and hope that there's enough redundancy in our antioxidant mechanisms in our cells to allow for an actual protective effect in ALS. And that's really what this diagram is showing you. We're getting rid of the SOD1 protein, reducing the levels of it. This is something that is injected into the spinal fluid, similar to what I said with the Brainstorm stem cells that are injected in the CSF. It has now been stepped up from a phase 1 clinical trial straight into a 144 participant phase 3 clinical trial, at least according to clinicaltrials.gov. That's the amount. There are sites in Canada that are recruiting for this clinical trial. For those who are on the actual therapy, there's an extension study. And this is actually something that I don't talk about, and I should have talked about in the last one. And in a lot of clinical trials these days, there will be an attempt to have extension studies for people to stay on drug, whether they were on placebo or on active drug, everyone who's in the study, if a company can afford to do this, often we'll move forward with extension studies to allow people to access the drug itself moving forward after the study is over. In terms of the data, again, underpowered, so we cannot say with sufficient evidence that any of these things work. That's why it's going to phase 3 clinical trial. But again, very interesting data. In fact, if you look here, these are the individuals who are on Tofersen, both fast progressors and non-fast progressors. And you can see that over the period of time of the study, there was a stabilization of both 2 different measures that I've talked about in the past. And one of the cool things about this particular study is it really is one of those biomarker balance studies I've talked about before to tell us, is Tofersen actually doing what it's supposed to do in people that it's being treated on? And in this case, they were able to show that there's a reduction in the SOD1 levels in the cerebrospinal fluid, again, showing that they're removing SOD1, and potentially that is the reason why it could be having positive effects. And again, the reason why you need to do a phase 3 clinical trial is that even though these look very promising data, we simply cannot tell yet whether or not this works. Now, there are other ASOs that are already in clinical trial. One is a C9orf72 antisense oligonucleotide. C9orf72 was discovered in 2011 as the most prominent genetic cause of ALS. It actually causes about 40% of familial cases, but actually almost 8-10% of sporadic cases, making it a very important target to be able to treat. I can't get into the details here as to why it can be a genetic mutation causing sporadic disease, but you can certainly talk about that afterwards if you'd like. When we discovered this, we didn't know what the C9orf72 protein did. We didn't know what its function was, but we're still sort of learning that, but we have come a long way. But what we are learning really is that people who have the mutation with C9orf72 ultimately seem to have both a loss of a reduced ability for it to have its normal function, which we're still trying to learn exactly what that is. We know some of it, and also gains some extra toxic function, which can make it very complicated to treat in a way, because it's both trying to replace what is lost when the mutation happens there, and also block what is added in a toxic respect when the mutation is there. I'm going to actually skip this slide. This was sort of an explanation as to how that makes sense. But basically that, you know, if you have any gene that you have in your body, you receive one version from your mother, one version from your father. And this allows us to have often some level of normal C9orf72 protein, but also one version of the mutant protein. And the combination of those two things have the potential to have both a loss of the abnormal function because you don't have enough of it, and also a gain of function. But what we do know is that with the antisense oligonucleotide, you can actually eliminate, at least try to eliminate that toxic byproduct function. And what's cool about the particular ASO that's in trial right now by Biogen is that it's primarily targeting only the mutant form. So it's designed in a way that it shouldn't reduce any of the additional C9orf72 normal protein that's there. That's helpful. That shouldn't exacerbate that part of it. So we're interested to see what will happen there. But again, this is a phase 1 safety study, not powered up for really understanding if it works for the disease or not at this point. There's another ASO that is soon to come to trial by Wave Life Sciences that you can look for. There are other technology to knock down C9orf72 coming in the near future probably. And there are likely more ASOs in trial soon, because as you can imagine, this is a flexible way that we know works, because there are actually therapies on the market that are ASOs that do work in humans. We know that these work to be able to knock down certain proteins, and can we use this technology to focus on other targets as well in ALS? So I've got 10 minutes left, and I'm already only at the phase 2 studies, but I'm going to move through these pretty quickly. I apologize profusely to people who really have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. Normally I try to keep these on time, but again, I'm also trying to make sure, because this is streaming, that we're going to cover as much as we can. This is really that first potential indication of whether or not there might be efficacy and a reason to move to phase 3 clinical trial. But again, I'm going to reiterate that it's very important not to overinterpret the data when it's not statistically significant. These are really still designed to make sure that in a larger group of people, is this regimen going to be safe and tolerable for those individuals? Most of the time, these are where the maximum amount that nonprofits like ourselves or ALS Association or MND Association can actually help to support. Largely these days, if you want a large phase 2 clinical trial that is a complicated regimen, they're often out of the price range of these type of things. So this is where we really rely on industry to be able to push these kinds of things forward. And the results help in investing in a phase 3. What I can say is often you're going to see that there are more phase 2 studies than anything else, because it's really the make or break stage as to whether you move forward into that big investment in phase 3. And a lot of things that are deemed safe may not really give that inkling to move forward. First one I'm going to focus on very quickly is called Pimozide. It is funded by ALS Canada and Brain Canada through a Hudson grant. It is a Canadian study that comes basically from prominent work by ALS models in fish and worms from Dr. Pierre Drapeau and Dr. Alex Parker at the University of Montreal, and leading to a collaboration with Dr. Lawrence Horngut at University of Calgary to be able to put this in clinical trial. The idea is that this old schizophrenic drug used for various aspects of tics and psychoses may be able to strengthen the neuromuscular junction. And so this is in a 100 participant clinical trial to hope to be able to see some evidence as to whether it's slowing progression of disease or perhaps to move forward to another trial if needed. One of the interesting things about this is you can be on this trial if you're eligible with all the criteria and taking a darvone. Furthermore, it's something that if people ask for it, because again, it's available for schizophrenia, it's very highly recommended that you speak to your ALS clinician, because some of the side effects of this drug mean that it should be very carefully monitored in a clinical trial sense if anyone with ALS is actually trying Pimozide, which is why it's highly recommended that only tested within the clinical trial. Hopefully by 2020, we should have some results as to where this trial ended up. And there is much more information on it available on streaming webinars from Dr. Horngut, and a more recent one, which is sort of an update that we hopefully will have up soon as well. Many of the phase 2 trials, as I spoke about, are targeting those immune and inflammatory mechanisms that provide an unfavorable neighborhood for motor neurons to survive in. One of them is HP Acthar Gel. This again has Canadian sites, a company called Mallinckrodt. It's a long time medication that's been well known to sort of provide what's called a synthetic form of cortisol, which is a hormone that's released from the brain. That can actually, I noticed there's a word, sorry, secreted hormones here. That is, can reduce some of those immune and inflammatory mechanisms. And it's a subcutaneous injection. The results, again, will probably be available in about 2021 to be able to see whether or not this has any effect on ALS. Other prominent phase 2 clinical trials, one that's sometimes called the bubble trial. Oxygenated nanobubbles by Reldasemtiv are being looked at as potentially affecting those immune and inflammatory mechanisms. This is a US trial in phase 2, again with an interesting mode of delivery and inhalation and nebulized inhalation, and again targeting sort of those similar mechanisms. Another one that might be of interest is called the MiroCals trial. It's a European trial where they're targeting sort of a subcutaneous injection of something called IL-2, which can drive the production of what are called more T regulatory cells. Very prominent work from a gentleman named Dr. Stan Appel has shown over the years in preclinical work that T regulatory cells can be protective of motor neurons, at least in ALS mice. So the idea here is, can you provide more of the T regulatory cells to decrease and sort of provide a more favorable neighborhood for those surviving motor neurons? So that's an interesting clinical trial. We'll talk about the Dr. Appel trial that I know has been getting some press as well when we get to phase 1, which won't be that long from now, I promise. Amylyx is a combination therapy where they took 2 therapies that are shown to potentially reduce neuronal cell death mechanisms, that had phase 2 studies with interesting but underpowered data, and saw if they compounded these, could they potentially have an effect. And that phase 2 trial, I think the results should be available either later this year or early 2020. I believe it is just finished and is in the data analysis stage, or at least is close to that right now. Ibudilast is another one that is looking at similar inflammatory and glial activation mechanisms. They ran a phase 2 clinical trial that was underpowered, did not have statistical significance, but had interesting enough data that they wanted to think about moving it forward. are now in a biomarker trial to really be able to say, can we put this forward with our best foot forward in a phase 3 clinical trial? If they're going to invest in that, ultimately they want to make sure they have the right biomarkers to be able to analyze the data as effectively as possible. All of these immune and inflammatory mechanism ones, as we learn more about the specifics of these, we're going to have less generalized therapies. And I think moving forward, we're going to have more targeted molecular therapies that can block the right things that will hopefully turn those abnormal cells that are neighboring motor neurons back into a healthier environment for them to survive in. I'm happy to discuss any of these. There are so many phase 2 clinical trials happening in ALS. You can look up any of these on clinicaltrials.gov or other sources. Ferroprone is an iron chelator in France. IC14 is an antibody, again, against one of those immune inflammatory mechanisms. Rapamycin is a stimulation of something called autophagy, which is a cellular garbage can of sorts. I'm trying to turn things over and help from the blockages in that pathway. IPL344 is something in Israel that is looking at a previously examined mechanism for building motor neurons into something more robust, using a survival pathway called the AKT pathway. ILB is a UK trial, a small one that's looking at potential multiple mechanisms, both inflammatory immune mechanisms and also reducing clumps of proteins. Colchicine and inosine are looking at sort of different ways to be able to moderate urate or uric acid levels. There's some correlation between people who have gout maybe having lower risk for ALS. That's not a confirmed thing, I believe. I'd have to look that up. I apologize. So playing with those uric acid levels might have a potential effect. Again, phase 2, trying to see if there's some indication of that. There are a number of trials that are using things that are active in other disease indications around neuronal firing that are being tested in various places. Nudexta is something that is used for the pathological sort of laughing and crying called pseudobulbar affect that may accompany some people with ALS. And it does work quite well for that, but there's some belief that it may also slow down the loss of bulbar functions. So there are clinical trials happening around that. There's a trial in Australia around CBD oil, but it's very small. It says it's a phase 3. Not too sure about that. I haven't learned enough about that one yet to be able to speak about it. L-serine is based around a hypothesis that BMAA toxicity, which is a long story I can certainly talk about as well if you'd like afterwards, is a phase 2 clinical trial happening in the US. An anti-inflammatory anti-aggregation thing called EPI 589 just finished a phase 2 clinical trial of 20 people, trying to see if there's any indication to move forward with that. And based around some theories that there may be activated retroviruses in the motor neurons leading to ALS in some cases, there are some antiretroviral therapies that are in phase 2 clinical trial in the United States and Australia as well. In terms of phase 1 studies, I know I'm at 1 o'clock, so I really apologize for anyone who has a hard stop. I'm not that far from done. These are going to be quite short. I really want to highlight the phase 3 clinical trials that are the most promising things sort of at the tail end of the process. Again, these are really the first steps, first in human kind of studies that are looking for the right doses and whether or not it's safe and tolerable for people to take. Got to focus on 2 of them right directly here that people have talked a lot about. The first one is a T regulatory cell transplant. Again, this is based on work of a very prominent clinician and scientist, very respected scientist, Dr. Stanley Appel from Methodist at University in Houston. And the idea behind this work is that, you know, in our body, the bone marrow cells that go to the thymus, which is, I'll show you on the next slide, which is an organ in the body, turn into T cells. And these T cells normally have a regulatory effect that can help modify the immune system. But in ALS, they tend to have more often a negative effect. And so the idea here is, can you remove the T cells from an individual and drive these cells into the regulatory cells? So a person with ALS, turn those cells that have turned kind of not supportive anymore back into the supportive form, and then replace them back into the individual in the hopes that they can slow progression of the disease. And so this is just to show you T cells originate as stem cells in the bone marrow. There are, as specific cells in the bone marrow that go through the bloodstream to the thymus. They then become these T cells, and then they can actually go around and have specific functions through our circulatory system. And in patients with ALS, people with ALS, it turns out that these Tregs can be dysfunctional, and the idea is, can you remove them from the individual, turn them back to the functional form, and replace them as a transplant? The key pieces here are only 4 people have been studied to date. In terms of the clinical trial, it's a very expensive clinical trial to run. We really don't know anything. And the study was open label, again, meaning that the people who were on the trial knew they were on the trial. So there is some level of investment in wanting to make sure that it is working. Now, that's not to say it's not working. It could be working, but the actual answer is that we really just don't know. And when these underpowered studies happen, we simply don't know until you put them into larger clinical trials. And Dr. Pell has had promising results in small number of individuals before that have moved forward to clinical trials that we still don't have answers on as well. And that is not at all to say that this isn't very promising and interesting work, but again, it has to go through the right processes. And we're very hopeful that this work will ultimately lead to better clinical trials and results that will work for people living with ALS. The other one that I want to mention, copper ATSM, this has gotten a lot of press as well lately from collaborative medicinal development. This is actually one that, based on the preclinical work, I was really telling a lot of people over the past several years, I would love to see this in clinical trial because it has some very intriguing data in mouse models of ALS, leading to the idea that we would like to see this move forward to clinical trials. Now, the key piece around this when interpreting this data is it was very small. It was a phase 1 that was designed to see if it was safe, and the study was open label. Again, just like I said with the other ones, people know that they were on the treatment, and in this case, they were only compared to a historical control. So that's basically trying to pick a group of people who have been on placebos in other trials and saying, we're going to compare the people in this trial over a certain period of time, whether or not it has an effect versus, an average of people that you choose from a database. And for various reasons, that's not really a way that we should be working yet, or we're capable of working effectively in ALS at this point. The key piece is it was safe, and it is important to move it forward to the next set of trials, so that's great news. And everyone does want this to work, so self-reporting of function can be a difficult thing to ascertain as to whether anything works or not. It must be also noticed that this was only 29 participants in a phase 1 clinical trial, and even though it was reported as 70% slowing of disease in one of those doses that were tested, this was about 7 people, and that is very much too small to be able to test, especially when it's an open label trial. It is not peer reviewed or published yet, and we are as excited as anyone that the phase 2 clinical trial will move forward, and the Fight MND Society in Australia is putting forward a $1 million grant to help them move the phase 2 clinical trial forward to hopefully get more evidence. But again, unless that's a powered up and very well designed study, it may still be too small to be able to see with any great effect. We will have to see as to whether it actually works. So when you see things like this, and I am being very direct here, where it says this is the first human evidence for disease-modifying drug in motor neuron disease, that is not true, largely because there isn't evidence for it having a disease-modifying effect, and it is certainly not the first time that we've seen underpowered non-statistical data from anything through to even as far as back as dexpramipexole in 2012 and other things that show promise but don't necessarily pan out. And we hope this does pan out. We really do. We just simply don't know. And this brings back to that conundrum where really need to all work together to try to drive these forward to phase 3. But we also have to remember that pharma is in a position where they're trying to sell their results for investment, and they have to work as a business that ultimately has that return on investment happening. And so when you are reading a media release of a phase 2 or phase 1 clinical trial, you have to take into account all of the information as to whether we actually can say whether or not it is working. And if it seems to be promising, are we really, do we really know for sure if that's the case or not? And that's why these further trials actually have to happen in a scientific and well-designed manner to be able to get an answer. But again, we need to find, and we are working on more efficient, more effective ways to get to those answers as quickly as possible. Because if these things truly do work, how do we get them tested and proven as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible? There are other phase 1 clinical trials. I'm not going to focus on most of them in too much detail. Genentech has a phase 1 clinical trial of something called GDC0134, based on some preclinical data that you can see here. We'll find out probably by next year, I think, whether or not that is safe and tolerable. There are some interesting ones that are based on some of that data that we found in the past 5 to 7 years. Denali Therapeutics has a RIPK1 inhibitor. You can see that there have been some prominent publications around that being a potential cell death mechanism in motor neurons. So that'll be interesting to see move forward. Also, Biogen is moving something forward that is based around a hypothesis that has really been growing over the past several years, that we do know in motor neurons that the movement of things between the nucleus and outside of the nucleus is abnormal in a lot of different ways. And so this is sort of the first kick of the can to be able to say if this thing that sort of inhibits the export of things from the nucleus can have some effect on ALS. And as time moves forward, if this one doesn't work, we will certainly find more targeted therapies in the future, but hopefully, you know, this one might actually pan out as well. But we're really at the stage where it's a first-in-human study to be able to see if it has safety and tolerability. And there are a number of other ones that I'm not going to go into since I'm already over time. And if you hear about these, there's certainly going to be ones out there that I don't know about. I'd love to hear about them all the time, or anything you find on the internet. Because that helps to expand the global knowledge of what I can be able to share with others about the what's happening in clinical trials on ALS. In terms of coming soon, that drug Zolgensma I talked about, which was for spinal muscular atrophy, they do have an investigational new drug application out, not yet in phase 1, for an AAV9 viral vector. So it's the same sort of delivery mechanism as that Zolgensma, where you're injecting something that can knock down SOD1 levels and not have to be repeated exposures like the antisense oligonucleotides. There are still some hurdles, I think, there. But again, this is something that I know they're driving forward with. I think there's another company looking at a similar thing that I'm not mentioning here. I should have mentioned, called Voyager, also looking into this. Analysis Therapeutics is something that should be in phase 1 clinical trials soon, I believe. This is a monoclonal antibody, again, targeting those immune inflammatory mechanisms in a very targeted way. What's kind of unique and interesting about this trial is the ALS Therapy Development Institute, which is a nonprofit that has been working in Massachusetts on ALS for many, many years, well over a decade. Of all the years that they've been working specifically on trying to find therapeutics for ALS, this is the first one that they feel confident enough to move forward and put investment in towards clinical trial, which makes it a very exciting idea. Means they very rigorously preclinically tested it, that's for sure. I already talked a little bit about Nuedexta, whether or not that one can move forward to a phase 3 clinical trial. I know the investigator behind it has been actively seeking a potential to do that. And in terms of these ASOs, there's one that might be moving forward into phase 1 in the near future around something called Ataxin-2, which wouldn't be targeting actually familial ALS, but actually would be targeting sporadic ALS. And would be a way of showing how those ASOs can have flexibility beyond people who have inherited forms of the disease. And again, certainly there are more that are under my radar that I'm not yet aware of, and I'm always happy to hear about those things. And there's definitely a lot of work being put into trying to move things out of the lab and into the clinic that are the most likely candidates to have potential targeted effects on ALS. I'm not going to focus on this very quick, just only quickly. This is a phase 1 clinical trial that ALS Canada is funding. This for a delivery mechanism called Focus Ultrasound in Sunnybrook Research Institute in Toronto. This is actually a way to hopefully be able to drive things, therapies out of the bloodstream and into the brain, which might have an interesting effect on upper motor neuron specific targeting drugs, which haven't been really tested a lot in ALS, and there's some promising or interesting data for some of those in laboratory models. So we'll look how that moves forward, but right now, again, seeing if the actual mechanism of this is safe. There are some diet-based interventions that are out there. The only reason why I show this is because, you know, there's a lot of anecdotal things out there, but it's certainly important that if something is going to be modified by diet, to really be able to say whether it works or not, it needs to be in rigorous clinical trials. And some of those do happen in various countries around the world. How do I get involved in a clinical trial? Contacting your ALS specialized clinic or multidisciplinary clinic is the best thing you can do. If you are not going to one, please contact us. We can happily tell you where your closest one is. Ask them if you're available to be involved in any clinical trials and what your eligibility might be. If they can't tell you or they don't tell you, certainly you can go to sources like clinicaltrials.gov and you can contact the clinics for any one of the studies on there to see if you are eligible for the particular studies. If you are eligible for one of the trials, then do not worry, because the clinical trial coordinators who are associated with that study will help walk you through everything and take care of you as you go through it, because again, you are being a participant and a volunteer that is helping research move forward. It's a philanthropic effort. Clinical trials can be found, the Canadian ones for ALS, on our website. The best source is still clinicaltrials.gov, the best source anywhere in the world. A quick walkthrough of this. I know I'm well over time, but I'm still going to do this because I think it's important. If people don't know how to use it, it can be quite daunting. You can use an advanced search to find even more things to search for. For example, what's happening in a specific country or different types of trials. You can start typing in amyotrophic and you'll see ALS comes up. You can click that one on there. You can see all of the different trials that have happened or are happening. Over to the left here, you can see that you can pick ones that are recruiting or about to start recruiting. So you can focus on those if you're interested in participating. You can type in a specific search term like Pimozide, and that will give you the information on that particular clinical trial. Then you'll be given this very long web page, which has a lot of daunting information on it, but it's all the information you really need to be able to learn about the study. It can tell you about who's actually involved in it, who's running the study, who's funding the study. What are the different potential arms that you can be involved in when you're participating? So in this case, a placebo versus Pimozide, a little description around where it came from, how many participants are in it, what type of trial it is it blinded or is it open label? And that was something I talked a lot about, was open label clinical trials versus the ones where both the investigator and the person on the trial is blinded as to whether they're on placebo or not, to really get an unbiased effect as to whether it's working. You can get some information about when it's going to be completed, the different regimens that are happening. What are the ways in which the study is going to measure if it's having an effect on ALS? What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? And as I said in webinar version 1, this is not meant to be a lack of compassion when people are not eligible for clinical trials. It is because it is such a very difficult thing to balance these trials to get good answers, that they need to have very rigorous criteria to make sure that they can get an answer in the end, and that the investment actually leads to an answer that can move forward into the next stage, whether that be approval or whether that be the next clinical trial. All the different locations that it's happening in, and one of the key aspects here is the contacts of who you can email to ask more questions about the particular study. There's also an EU clinical trials register and a World Health Organization trial register. Sometimes they have things that aren't found on clinicaltrials.gov, so you can always search those as well if you like. Clinicaltrials.gov is probably the most comprehensive one. There's also a Government of Canada one if you feel like using that one. The last slide or two, all I want to say is when we're talking about clinical trials, it also comes back to alternative therapies that people ask a lot about. And when do I really need to be careful about these things? Okay, the first and major thing I can say here, because I can give a whole webinar on this, and actually Dr. Richard Bedlack, who leads something called ALS Untangles, does give full presentations on these alternative therapies. But if it sounds too good to be true, unfortunately it is. And again, that's not a fun message to give, but it is the truth. If you're charged money for any treatment by a clinic, at this point, there's no way to guarantee that there's any benefit or any safety, no matter what they are saying, because it has not been proven in any kind of clinical trial. Often people will pay money and actually the treatment can make things worse. I urge you to maybe look at the Gleason documentary as an example where some adverse events came from paying at a stem cell clinic, which is a great depiction of how that can possibly happen. You will see that these are very shiny and very professional looking websites often, where they will claim to treat multiple complicated diseases with a specific regimen. Again, if it sounds too good to be true, it usually is, or in this case, it always is. Websites that are claiming that they're doing it for you because the trial process takes too long, that's often a way for them to try to show what they're trying to show compassion in a way that ultimately is taking money from individuals who are, in a way, again, being very direct, capitalizing on desperation. And be very wary of testimonials. And I urge anyone to find someone who's in a testimonial on one of his websites and be able to find them on social media living the great new life they have with this therapy that has apparently changed that life. And I've done a lot of digging on those, and it's been very hard to find anyone who really lives up to that kind of a testimonial situation. And ultimately, the biggest thing is ask your clinician. I can't emphasize that enough, as well as the fact that, once again, if there was anything out there that worked, I promise you that the investigators in ALS, the clinicians, the scientists, the researchers, us at ALS Canada, everywhere else working on ALS would get this to you as quickly as possible, because we really want this to happen. ALS Untangled is a great resource to go for open source information, where scientists and clinicians are actually giving information on a lot of these alternative treatments and trying to say, what do we know, what don't we know, so that you can get a little bit of a scientific background on some of these. Anywhere from cannabis use to gluten-free diet. Some of these can be really valuable resources to read up on. A prominent one I'll mention, Lyme disease. There's a talk about Lyme disease in there as a question that I get quite frequently, and I point to the ALS Untangled because it's a great review of really where the field sees that particular issue that's being focused on. That's it. I apologize for those who have gone 1 hour and 16 minutes. I really wanted to be as comprehensive as possible, because I didn't want to just pick certain trials out, because ultimately we don't care where the treatments come from. We just want one of these or multiple of these to hit and land and be really rigorously proven that they actually work for ALS, so we can get these to people as quickly as possible. So I am going to now, it's gonna be a little strange because normally I have someone to help me. I'm gonna check out the questions that have come in, and I'm going to try to answer some of these. Will this webinar be available after reviewing the live performance? Yes, it will. Actually, we're going to be putting this up on our website, so you will be able to stream it. I'm just going to see if there's actually more questions. I'm having a little trouble here. You can certainly log off if you are not interested. Let's see. Actually, oh yeah, there are some more. It's just not being very cooperative. Let's see if, there we go. Okay, there are a few questions. Okay, my apologies. This is just trying to expand the, okay, having a little trouble reading these, but I'm gonna give it another shot here. This must be really annoying for people. Okay. What does SVC stand for? Superior vena cava. Okay. That person has actually left, but it stands for slow vital capacity. And it's a measure of taking in as deep of a breath as possible and then breathing out as much as you're able to. And it's a measure of lung function that's actually been attached as a outcome measure for a lot of different trials, and particularly has been used in the muscle trials because it's been found as a sensitive way to measure whether or not there's a slowing of progression for therapies that are targeting better muscle function, like the cytokinetics trial and the Orion trial. But something that we would probably see as a secondary outcome measure, maybe not the primary one, for a lot of trials also moving forward beyond those ones. Thank you for all this information, Zamora. That's very nice. Thank you for the comment. Is the MIND trial still going on? So if this is referring to Project MIND, I'm not sure if that one is. Can certainly email me afterwards if that's not the right one. It's actually not a clinical trial of sorts. It's a study which is bringing together 20 countries from around the world to leverage funding and resources to be able to study an unprecedented level of people with ALS from a what's called a whole genome sequencing standpoint. So all of the genes we've discovered and used as tools to understand ALS have come from about 2% of all of our genetics. But we now have the capability and the availability, at least cost-wise, to some extent, be able to study all 100% of our genome. That means we're going to learn tons more about the disease and what's happening at a base level than we've ever been able to look at before. And it's so expensive, though, to do this that we need to be able to leverage multiple countries to get enough people involved and enough money to be able to do it. They are at about 50%, and so yes, it is still moving forward. Canada has reached about 20% of its goal of doing 1,000 whole genome sequences. But once it's all contributed, we think we're going to have pretty much a good-sized open database that's going to allow us to understand how genetics work in ALS from a very base level. So it's ongoing, it's moving forward, it's very exciting, but still lots to do and lots to contribute to be able to make that one a success. Is Tofersen only for familial ALS patients? Great question, because there is obviously a lot of information out there that suggests that SOD1 could be involved in sporadic disease. I would say that that's very much like a phase 2 clinical trial. We don't know the answer to that. We really don't know if that's true or not. It hasn't been definitively proven. It hasn't been definitively unproven. So for to date, yes, Tofersen is for people who are living with familial ALS. Certainly the clinical trials that are happening right now are only for individuals who have SOD1 mutations. You know, we still have to understand at the preclinical level whether or not SOD1 has any effect on the sporadic disease. Okay, another question that might only be answered by a medical doctor, but we'll ask anyway. Sister has edaravone infusions for a year. How long should she stay on it? In a very limited information I have about the medication, I understand edaravone's effect on the body or effectiveness has been studied for this long. I'm not sure. Okay, I understand. Definitely a question for your clinician, not something that I have the medical capabilities to be able to answer, especially given the specific aspects of your sister's ALS. What I can say about the edaravone is, yes, we don't have really long-term studies to determine how it affects or how long it works for. What we do have is the clinical trial that has happened that has shown slowing disease in some people by 30%, when very specific eligibility criteria for that clinical trial. However, we still don't know. It might work for more people. It might work for a long time, and those are things that future will hopefully tell us those kinds of answers. So best for a medical physician to be able to discuss that, but we look forward to learning more about what edaravone can do, because obviously if it can work for some people as well proven, then it may also have a wider effect as well. Okay, so someone told me I'm over time. Thank you for that. I apologize again for that. Will Masitinib trial allow patients on edaravone? That is a great question. I don't think so, but I can confirm on that. So for the individual who had that, if you want to actually send me an email at dtaylor@als.ca, I'll respond to the email once I find out. Clinicaltrials.gov does have that up on the website, so you can also look there. I don't think that is the case, though I don't know, because it has been delayed, whether or not they have changed the clinical trial criteria for what will eventually start recruiting. It's a great question. In your opinion, is the ALS Institute in the US an above-the-board organization? If referring to the ALS Association, I have nothing but the utmost respect for the ALS Association. They have had, they've managed the Ice Bucket Challenge funds with a lot of rigor, and being very careful to make sure that they're putting out a lot of funds to the community to build on research, to build on our understanding, to try to put things to help move things along towards therapies as quickly as possible, to build infrastructure for the community, but at the same time, making sure that they're not throwing all that money into everything right away, because we are learning things, and how do we continue that very precious gift in the most effective way possible. And that's something that none of us were equipped for in ALS, to be able to handle that kind of funds. We hope we can learn more in the future because we can get those kinds of funds. But the amount of care that they truly have on getting to therapies and getting to treatments at any of the institutes, ALS TDI, ALS Association in the United States, those individuals do truly care. And I know this from from a lot of years of connecting with them, so that's my personal opinion on that one. Again, as I said, always my personal opinion only. Ice Bucket Challenge money was a one-time funding source. What is the ALS Society doing to improve funding or industry partners? That is actually a great question as well. we're working all the time to try to find new sources of funding, private donors that can help us. We have a lot of emphasis on trying to fundraise through major gifts, through corporations, through how can we connect with multiple pharmaceutical companies to try to help us drive research forward. You know, anything we can do, partnering with other organizations around the world, that's a big one. How do we have more international impact by leveraging what each other are doing? Project Mine is a great example of that, and it's something that we are actively working on all the time. We also have to remember that, you know, with coming an underfunded disease also comes underfunded human resources, and we work very hard as a very small team to be able to do the best we can to be able to advance. And I can say that, you know, ALS Canada, ALS Association, M&D Association, these other ones around the world have been advancing their revenue streams each year, while other diseases sometimes are seeing reductions. And a lot of that is due to the very hard work that is being put into trying to find new sources of funding and partnership. But always open to ideas, so please send them our way. Because you know, nothing is ever going to be enough to get us there as quickly as we need to get there. Okay, and the last question that I have here is Levosimendan supposed to work on all muscle or only the diaphragm muscle? As I understand it, this is targeting muscle in general. It's actually originally targeted towards cardiac muscle. So the idea would be that they're looking at diaphragm muscle as a readout, as a more sensitive readout. But ultimately looking at multiple muscles. Muscle function tests are something that are advancing a lot in ALS research as an endpoint. Something called handheld dynamometry is an example. Another one, I'm trying to remember what's called Atlas. A couple of other tests are really in the process of trying to get them to determine whether or not they'll be valid endpoint measures for ALS moving forward. I think those would be great ones to potentially involve in any kind of muscle-related trials moving forward. But it is not just looking at diaphragm muscle, I believe, but ultimately that being the output that they're looking to best see if it works. So I'm also going to check here. Last thing, I had a hand up, but I don't see anyone related to that. So what I will say is, if you have any questions whatsoever, please email research@als.ca or detailer@als.ca. Thank you so much for your time. I apologize for going over. If there are any questions, I'm always available for those. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. Okay, take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.